April 30th, 1945. Beneath the shattered streets of Berlin, around 8 meters below the gardens of the Reich Chancellery, the air feels heavy with damp concrete, tobacco smoke, diesel fumes, and exhaustion. Above ground, Soviet artillery pounds the city without pause. Each impact sends a faint tremor through reinforced walls that were designed to withstand bombs, but never intended to become the final refuge of a collapsing empire. Electric lights flicker along narrow corridors painted in muted colors. Ventilation fans hum relentlessly, struggling to push fresh air through rooms that have become crowded with soldiers, secretaries, doctors, aides, and guards. Time itself seems to have slowed. Outside, smoke rolls across Berlin like a permanent storm cloud. Entire streets have disappeared beneath mountains of brick and twisted steel. Fires burn unchecked. The thunder of artillery has become so constant that moments of silence feel almost unnatural. According to Soviet operational reports, thousands of guns and rocket launchers are concentrated against the German capital during the final assault. Every few seconds, another shell lands somewhere above the bunker, sending dust drifting from ceilings that had once represented security. Deep underground, maps still hang on walls, their colored pins attempting to impose order upon a battlefield that no longer obeys commands issued from this hidden headquarters. Telephones ring. Messages arrive from formations that have already ceased to exist. Couriers move briskly through cramped passageways carrying reports whose military value diminishes almost as quickly as they are delivered. The machinery of government continues to operate, yet the nation it claims to govern is rapidly disappearing. In one small room sits Adolf Hitler, physically diminished after years of war and declining health. Witnesses who survived the final days consistently describe a man whose appearance bore little resemblance to the confident leader presented in propaganda films earlier in the conflict. His movements are slow. His left hand reportedly trembles. His face appears pale beneath harsh electric lighting. Yet despite overwhelming evidence that Berlin cannot be defended, conferences continue with military officers whose options have become almost impossible. The Führerbunker, connected to the older Vorbunker above it, has become the last functioning center of Nazi political authority. Records indicate that construction of the deeper bunker was completed in stages between 1943 and 1944, reflecting the increasing danger posed by Allied bombing campaigns. Reinforced concrete walls, several meters thick in places, surround a network of roughly 30 rooms linked by narrow corridors. Heavy steel blast doors separate key sections. Independent electrical generators, water supplies, and ventilation systems allow occupants to survive even while destruction engulfs the world above. Yet no engineering achievement can isolate those inside from reality. Every report arriving from the front paints the same picture. Soviet forces are advancing street by street. American and British armies have crossed deep into Western Germany. Millions have already died across Europe. The Third Reich, which only a few years earlier controlled vast territories stretching from the Atlantic coast towards the outskirts of Moscow, has contracted to little more than isolated pockets of resistance. Within these underground rooms, decisions are still being made. Promotions are announced. Decorations are awarded. Military formations are ordered to attack despite lacking men, ammunition, or fuel. Historians continue to debate precisely how much Hitler believed these increasingly unrealistic reports, but surviving documents leave little doubt that the disconnect between command and battlefield reality had reached extraordinary proportions. The bunker itself seems strangely ordinary. Furniture is practical rather than luxurious. Corridors are narrow enough that two people must sometimes turn sideways to pass one another. Bedrooms are small. Offices are crowded with filing cabinets, telephones, and communication equipment. It resembles less a palace than a heavily fortified government basement, built for survival rather than comfort. Yet within these confined rooms unfolds one of history's most consequential endings. Decisions made here influence surrender negotiations, military withdrawals, and the final hours of a regime responsible for unprecedented destruction across Europe. The bunker is not merely a shelter. It has become a symbol of political isolation, military collapse, and the fatal consequences of absolute power detached from reality. Few of those moving through its corridors can fully grasp how future generations will remember this place. To them, it is simply headquarters, the last secure location remaining amid the ruins of Berlin. But as shells continue to fall overhead and Soviet troops close the distance meter by meter, the reinforced concrete surrounding them is transforming into something far greater than an underground command post. It is becoming the physical embodiment of the collapse of Nazi Germany itself, a place where ambition, ideology, and military defeat converge beneath a city that is dying above it. To understand why this bunker became the final stage upon which the Third Reich met its end, it is necessary to step back several years, to a time when Germany's leaders believed they could still shape the course of the war. The very existence of such a fortress beneath the Reich Chancellery reflected changing realities. During the early years of the conflict, German victories across Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and France created an impression of unstoppable momentum. But by 1943, after defeats at Stalingrad and in North Africa, followed by increasingly destructive Allied bombing campaigns, the strategic situation had altered dramatically. German cities were now frequent targets for heavy bombers. Berlin itself experienced repeated air raids that exposed the vulnerability of government buildings. Existing shelters beneath the Reich Chancellery offered limited protection, but military planners recognized that senior leadership required a more secure command center capable of functioning even during sustained bombardment. According to wartime construction records, engineers expanded the existing underground complex into a much deeper reinforced bunker, protected beneath layers of earth and concrete specifically intended to resist high explosive bombs. The decision reflected not confidence, but necessity. As Allied aircraft grew more numerous and accurate, remaining above ground became increasingly hazardous. Communications had to survive. Government ministries needed continuity. Military orders still had to flow across occupied Europe. The bunker represented an attempt to preserve command under conditions that modern industrial warfare had made almost unavoidable. By the time Hitler permanently moved into the complex in January 1945, however, the strategic crisis had become immeasurably worse. Soviet armies were advancing rapidly from the east after the Vistula-Oder offensive, while Anglo-American forces pressed steadily from the west following the liberation of France and the crossing of the Rhine. Germany faced overwhelming pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously. Fuel shortages crippled armored formations. Luftwaffe operations declined sharply because experienced pilots and aviation fuel had become scarce. Railway networks suffered repeated disruption from bombing. Factories struggled to maintain production despite dispersal efforts and labor shortages. The bunker had been built to protect a government during air attack. Instead, it would become the final headquarters of a regime confronting complete military defeat. The strategic collapse confronting Germany during the winter of 1944 and 1945 was unlike anything its military planners had anticipated when the war began. On paper, the Wehrmacht still fielded hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Factories continued to manufacture tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Ministries remained open, and orders were issued daily from Berlin. Yet beneath these outward signs of authority lay a system strained beyond its limits. Fuel stocks had fallen to critical levels after the loss of Romanian oil fields and relentless Allied attacks on synthetic fuel plants. According to wartime production records, Germany's aviation fuel output had declined so sharply by late 1944 that many newly built aircraft could scarcely be flown before being committed to combat. Armored divisions often possessed tanks but lacked the diesel or petrol needed to move them. Locomotives stood idle for want of coal or because railway junctions had been bombed repeatedly. The strategic map was closing from every direction. In the west, American, British, Canadian, and other Allied armies crossed into Germany after months of fighting across France and Belgium. The failure of the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, known to many as the Battle of the Bulge, exhausted much of Germany's remaining offensive capability. Thousands of experienced soldiers, irreplaceable vehicles, and precious fuel reserves were lost in an operation that ultimately delayed rather than reversed defeat. In the east, the situation was even more severe. The Red Army's Vistula-Oder offensive, launched in January 1945, advanced with extraordinary speed. According to Soviet operational records, some formations covered hundreds of kilometers within weeks, overrunning defensive positions that German commanders had hoped would hold for months. Cities declared fortresses were bypassed or isolated. Entire army groups struggled to establish coherent defensive lines while retreating. Berlin itself, once considered safely beyond the reach of enemy artillery, now faced the possibility of direct assault. The capital remained the political heart of Nazi Germany and a major communications hub linking military headquarters, ministries, and regional authorities. Losing the city would not merely be a military setback. It would represent the visible collapse of the regime's authority. For Hitler, whose leadership increasingly revolved around personal control and direct intervention in military affairs, abandoning Berlin was almost unthinkable. Historians broadly agree that many senior officers urged relocation to southern Germany, where mountain regions and existing military facilities appeared more defensible. Hitler consistently rejected these proposals. His decision transformed the Führerbunker from an emergency shelter into the nerve center of the final campaign. Construction of the bunker reflected both engineering skill and growing wartime desperation. The underground complex actually consisted of two connected structures. The older Führerbunker, completed in 1936, lay beneath the Reich Chancellery and provided basic air raid protection. As Allied bombing intensified, engineers concluded that a much stronger facility was required. Between 1943 and 1944, work expanded downward to create the deeper Führerbunker approximately 8 meters below ground level. Building such a structure in the center of Berlin presented formidable challenges. Excavation had to proceed beneath existing government buildings without compromising their foundations. Reinforced concrete walls, several meters thick in places, were poured in carefully planned stages. Massive steel reinforcement bars formed an internal skeleton designed to absorb the shock of nearby explosions. Waterproofing systems became essential because the site lay close to groundwater, requiring continuous pumping and careful sealing to prevent flooding. Even after completion, maintenance crews regularly monitored water seepage. The finished complex resembled a compact underground headquarters rather than an elaborate residence. Roughly 30 rooms were arranged along narrow corridors, each serving a practical purpose. There were offices for military conferences, communications rooms crowded with telephone exchanges, map rooms, modest bedrooms, kitchens, storage areas, medical facilities, generator rooms, and ventilation equipment. Heavy, steel blast doors divided key sections so that damage in one area would not necessarily disable the entire complex. Electricity came from diesel-powered generators capable of operating independently should Berlin's main power supply fail. Fresh air entered through filtration and ventilation systems engineered to maintain breathable conditions even if fires or explosions contaminated the atmosphere above ground. Water was supplied through dedicated systems, while emergency provisions of food and medical supplies were stored within the bunker itself. These features reflected lessons learned from years of strategic bombing across Europe. Engineers understood that survival depended not only upon resisting direct hits, but also upon sustaining life when the outside world became inaccessible. Compared with underground headquarters built by other wartime powers, the Führerbunker was neither the largest nor the most technologically sophisticated. Britain's cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall prioritized communications and governmental continuity during air raids. Soviet command bunkers around Moscow focused upon dispersed leadership and operational resilience. Germany's final bunker, by contrast, gradually evolved into a place where political leadership became increasingly isolated from battlefield reality. Reinforced concrete could shield its occupants from bombs, but it could not restore broken supply lines, replace lost armies, or reverse strategic defeat. Inside the bunker, life settled into an unsettling routine, despite the chaos above. Secretaries typed orders throughout the day and often late into the night. Military conferences followed predictable schedules whenever circumstances allowed. Meals were served in cramped dining areas, though wartime shortages affected even those at the center of power. Witnesses later described stale air, constant artificial lighting, and an atmosphere that grew steadily more oppressive as Soviet forces approached. The absence of natural daylight disrupted any normal sense of time. Clocks, rather than the rising and setting of the sun, dictated daily life. Telephone operators worked tirelessly to maintain communications with Army headquarters, ministries, and surviving regional commands. Yet every passing day brought more broken connections. Lines were severed by shell fire. Radio stations fell silent. Messages increasingly reported withdrawals, encirclements, or complete loss of contact. Maps displayed colored arrows, representing formations that, in some cases, had already been destroyed. According to surviving operational records, commanders frequently struggled to verify the true positions of units amid the confusion of collapsing fronts. The bunker, therefore, became a paradox. Technically, it was a remarkable example of wartime engineering, designed to preserve command under the harshest imaginable conditions. Strategically, it symbolized the narrowing world of a leadership attempting to direct a modern war from beneath a city already being consumed by it. From these reinforced corridors would emerge some of the final orders issued by Nazi Germany. Some reflected genuine attempts to coordinate defense. Others rested upon assumptions that no longer matched events unfolding beyond the bunker's walls. As Soviet soldiers fought street by street towards the Reich Chancellery, the distance between the reports arriving underground and the reality above ground grew ever wider, setting the stage for the bunker's final and most consequential days. As the walls of the bunker insulated its occupants from the roar of explosions outside, they also became the setting for an increasingly desperate effort to command a war that was slipping beyond anyone's control. Understanding how that happened requires looking beyond the concrete itself to the people who built, operated, and depended upon this underground headquarters. The Führerbunker was not simply an engineering project. It was the product of Germany's wartime bureaucracy, military planning, and construction industry, all working together to create a command center capable of surviving the most intense aerial bombardment then imaginable. Responsibility for constructing the bunker fell under government building authorities working with military engineers and specialist contractors experienced in reinforced concrete construction. By the early 1940s, Germany had accumulated considerable expertise in protective structures. Across occupied Europe, engineers designed submarine pens, coastal fortifications, aircraft shelters, and command posts using enormous quantities of reinforced concrete. The same principles were applied beneath the Reich Chancellery, although on a much smaller scale. The bunker relied upon one material above all others: reinforced concrete. To an ordinary observer, concrete may appear little more than hardened stone, but when combined with a lattice of steel reinforcement bars, it behaves differently under immense pressure. Imagine placing a thick wooden board across two supports. Without reinforcement, enough weight eventually causes it to crack. Add a strong steel framework inside, however, and the structure can flex slightly while remaining intact. That combination of rigidity and resilience allowed the bunker to withstand nearby bomb blasts that would have destroyed conventional buildings. Exact measurements vary slightly between surviving architectural plans, but historians generally agree that sections of the roof measured approximately 3 to 4 meters thick, while major walls exceeded 2 meters in thickness. Above the reinforced roof lay additional layers of earth that helped absorb the force of explosions before shockwaves reached the occupied rooms below. The deeper location also reduced the danger posed by collapsing buildings on the surface. Water presented another engineering challenge. Berlin's groundwater lies relatively close to the surface in many districts, and excavating several meters downward risked constant flooding. Pumps operated continuously to remove seepage, while waterproof membranes and drainage systems attempted to keep the bunker dry. Even so, witnesses later recalled occasional dampness and the persistent smell of moisture mixing with diesel fuel, tobacco smoke, and stale air. Complete comfort had never been the objective. Survival had. Ventilation proved equally important. A sealed underground structure quickly becomes uninhabitable without a steady supply of fresh air. Powerful electric fans drew air through protected intake shafts while filters removed dust and debris. During heavy bombardment, these systems helped maintain breathable conditions despite smoke and fires above ground. Backup generators ensured that ventilation, lighting, and communications could continue even if Berlin's electrical grid failed entirely. The communications equipment represented the true heart of the bunker. Rows of telephone exchanges connected military headquarters, ministries, and regional authorities throughout what remained of the Reich. Radio operators maintained contact with formations whose wireless equipment still functioned. Map rooms received reports around the clock, updating colored markers intended to reflect rapidly changing front lines. In theory, this allowed Hitler and his senior staff to direct military operations across Germany. In practice, as transport networks collapsed and communication lines were severed, the information arriving underground became increasingly incomplete. Military conferences remained remarkably formal despite the deteriorating circumstances. Officers presented situation reports using maps spread across large tables. Army movements were discussed in terms of divisions, corps, and army groups, even when many formations had been reduced to fragments of their authorized strength. According to surviving records and eyewitness accounts, these conferences often lasted several hours, with detailed discussions about counterattacks that existing resources could scarcely support. Technology alone could not overcome the realities of modern industrial warfare. Germany's opponents possessed overwhelming advantages in manpower, fuel production, and manufacturing capacity. By 1945, the United States was producing thousands of aircraft each month, while Soviet factories beyond the Ural Mountains continued delivering tanks and artillery in extraordinary numbers. Britain maintained pressure through strategic bombing and naval control. Germany's engineering remained impressive in many areas, but no bunker, however carefully designed, could compensate for dwindling resources across an entire nation. Life inside the underground complex reflected these growing constraints. Food reached the bunker only while supply routes through Berlin remained open. Fresh produce became increasingly scarce, replaced by preserved rations and whatever could still be transported through the embattled capital. Water and electricity were rationed whenever necessary. Sleeping quarters were modest, with many occupants resting only a few hours between duties. The constant vibration of artillery, though muted by meters of concrete, served as a relentless reminder that the front line was drawing closer. Medical facilities within the bunker were similarly functional rather than elaborate. Doctors treated illnesses, exhaustion, and injuries sustained during movement through the city above. Supplies of medicines became more limited as the siege tightened. Records suggest that medical personnel faced the same uncertainty as everyone else, aware that evacuation was becoming progressively less likely with each passing day. Perhaps the most striking feature of the bunker was its contrast with the world above it. Underground, electric lights glowed steadily. Maps remained neatly arranged, and military routines continued with almost bureaucratic precision. Above ground, Berlin had become a battlefield of collapsed buildings, burning streets, and shattered transport networks. Civilians searched for water among ruins. Soldiers defended intersections that changed hands repeatedly. Smoke obscured familiar landmarks. The two worlds existed only a few meters apart, yet they might as well have belonged to different realities. By the middle of April 1945, those realities could no longer be separated. Soviet forces had crossed into the outskirts of Berlin and were advancing through district after district despite fierce German resistance. Artillery fire grew louder inside the bunker. Telephone calls became shorter as communications failed. Staff officers increasingly relied upon couriers willing to risk shell fire above ground. It was during these final weeks that the Führerbunker ceased to be merely a protected headquarters and became the stage upon which the last military and political decisions of Nazi Germany would unfold. The engineering that had preserved the command center through months of bombing had succeeded. The command itself, however, faced a challenge no concrete wall could ever withstand: the irreversible collapse of the war beyond its doors. By the final weeks of April 1945, the Führerbunker had become a place suspended between routine and catastrophe. Above ground, Berlin was collapsing under the weight of the largest battle ever fought on German territory. Below ground, a small group of officials continued to operate according to procedures established during a war that was now almost completely lost. The contrast was extraordinary. In the streets, civilians searched through ruins for food and shelter. Soldiers fought for individual buildings and railway stations. Inside the bunker, maps were updated, reports were studied, and orders were issued. The Battle of Berlin had begun in earnest on April 16, 1945, when Soviet forces launched a massive offensive against German defensive positions along the Oder and Neisse rivers. The Red Army had concentrated enormous strength for the final advance into the German capital. Soviet commanders committed more than 2 million personnel across the broader operation, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. Exact figures vary depending on how historians define participating forces, but the scale of the assault was overwhelming. German defenders, by contrast, faced impossible conditions. Units defending Berlin included regular army formations, Waffen-SS units, police forces, Volkssturm militia, and young recruits with limited training. Some soldiers possessed combat experience from years of fighting. Others had only recently received weapons. Many lacked proper equipment, ammunition, or even basic military supplies. The defense of Berlin was not a conventional battle between evenly matched armies. It was a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. As Soviet troops entered the city, fighting became intensely personal and urban. Streets, bridges, government buildings, and underground stations became defensive positions. Tanks moved carefully through narrow roads where ambushes could come from windows, basements, or ruined buildings. Artillery fire echoed between damaged structures, creating a battlefield where visibility was limited and movement was dangerous. From the bunker, Hitler received constant updates about this final struggle. Senior commanders attempted to explain the situation, sometimes presenting accurate assessments and sometimes delivering information shaped by political expectations. The most famous example involved imaginary or severely weakened formations that were expected to launch relief attacks against Soviet forces surrounding Berlin. Historians continue to debate the precise extent to which Hitler understood the military reality presented to him, but surviving documents demonstrate that many of the orders issued during these final days could not realistically be carried out. One of the last major hopes placed upon was an attack by forces commanded by General Felix Steiner. Hitler believed Steiner's units could strike Soviet positions and create an opening for the defense of Berlin. In reality, Steiner's available forces were far too weak to achieve the objective. When the situation became clear during a military conference on April 22, Hitler reportedly reacted with anger and despair, acknowledging that the war was effectively lost. The moment marked a psychological turning point inside the bunker. Yet even after accepting defeat, Hitler refused to leave Berlin. Several senior figures escaped or attempted to secure their own futures, but Hitler remained underground. The bunker had become both his command center and his final refuge. His presence ensured that the last stages of the Third Reich would unfold beneath the Reich Chancellery rather than somewhere beyond the battlefield. Among those inside were political officials, military officers, secretaries, and personal staff members. Some had spent years serving the Nazi regime. Others were simply employees trapped by circumstances. Their experiences varied greatly, and surviving accounts reveal an atmosphere of fear, uncertainty, and confusion. Some continued performing their duties mechanically. Others attempted to understand what would happen once Soviet troops reached the government district. The psychological pressure inside the bunker increased with every passing day. The ventilation system continued running, but the air became uncomfortable. Constant artificial lighting disrupted sleep patterns. The sound of artillery became louder. Even thick concrete walls could not completely hide the reality that Soviet forces were approaching the center of Berlin. On April 29, 1945, Hitler dictated his political testament and private will. In these final documents, he blamed enemies and internal betrayal for Germany's defeat while naming his successors within the collapsing regime. The same day, he married Eva Braun, his longtime companion, in a brief ceremony held inside the bunker. The event occurred while Soviet forces were only a short distance away, and fighting continued above ground. The following day, April 30, 1945, the final moments arrived. After saying farewell to those remaining in the bunker, Hitler and Eva Braun withdrew to private rooms. According to the accounts of survivors who later testified, Hitler died by suicide that afternoon. The exact details of the moment have been examined extensively by historians, but Soviet investigations, eyewitness testimony, and later research agree that Hitler died inside the Führerbunker as Soviet troops closed in on the Reich Chancellery. Afterwards, members of Hitler's staff carried out instructions to burn the bodies outside in the garden above the bunker. The attempt was only partially successful because of limited fuel and the conditions of the battlefield. Soviet forces eventually captured the area and discovered the remains. The precise identification of the bodies became the subject of decades of investigation and political dispute, although historians broadly accept the conclusion that Hitler died in the bunker on April 30, 1945. The fall of the Führerbunker did not immediately end all fighting. German forces continued resisting in parts of Berlin for several days. On May 2, 1945, General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the Berlin Defense Area, ordered the remaining German forces in the city to surrender. The fighting that had consumed the capital ended, leaving behind enormous destruction and human suffering. For the soldiers who had fought above ground, the bunker had been almost invisible. It was not a battlefield position like a bridge or fortress. It was a hidden command center from which orders traveled outward while the war approached inward. Its walls protected the people inside from bombs, but they could not protect them from the consequences of decisions made over years of conflict. The Führerbunker had fulfilled its original purpose as an air raid shelter and command facility. But history would remember it for a very different reason. It became the final headquarters of a regime whose ambitions had led Europe into catastrophic war, and the place where that regime finally collapsed beneath the weight of its own destruction. If you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribing genuinely helps us continue bringing remarkable true stories like this to the channel. The collapse of the Führerbunker must be understood not only as the end of a single command center, but as part of a much wider transformation in how nations protected leadership, managed warfare, and adapted to the realities of modern conflict. Underground headquarters were not unique to Nazi Germany. Across the Second World War, major powers invested heavily in protected command facilities. Each nation faced the same fundamental challenge. How could leaders continue directing military operations when enemy aircraft, artillery, and advancing armies threatened to destroy the centers of government? The British approach provides one of the clearest comparisons. During the Blitz of 1940 and 1941, The British government developed the Cabinet War Rooms beneath Whitehall in London. Unlike the Führerbunker, which became a final military headquarters during the collapse of a regime, Britain's underground complex was designed to preserve governmental continuity during a prolonged national struggle. It included communication rooms, operational maps, and offices where ministers and military leaders coordinated the war effort. The emphasis was not isolation, but connection. Information flowed between the bunker and the wider government structure. Germany's bunker system shared some similarities but developed under different circumstances. The Führerbunker was built primarily as protection for Hitler and his immediate leadership circle, while Germany also constructed other large command facilities across occupied Europe. Hitler's military headquarters, such as the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, were designed to allow direct supervision of operations away from Berlin. These complexes often included reinforced concrete shelters, communications networks, and security measures, but unlike the Führerbunker, they operated during periods when Germany still possessed strategic initiative. The Soviet Union also relied upon underground protection, particularly during the German advance toward Moscow in 1941. Stalin's government prepared defensive command facilities designed to ensure leadership survival if the capital came under direct threat. Soviet command structures placed enormous importance on maintaining communications between political leaders, military commanders, and industrial centers. The survival of Moscow as the Soviet capital became a symbol of national resistance, especially after the German offensive failed outside the city. The American approach was different again. The United States homeland was largely beyond the reach of enemy bombing during the war, meaning Washington did not require a Berlin-style underground headquarters. Instead, American wartime command focused heavily on communication networks, mobile military headquarters, and global coordination. The scale of American industrial production allowed commanders to operate across multiple theaters while relying on vast logistical systems connecting factories, ports, and battlefields. Technologically, the Führerbunker represented a strong example of defensive construction, but was not revolutionary compared with other wartime facilities. Its thick concrete walls, ventilation systems, and communications equipment were advanced for their purpose, yet similar engineering principles appeared in submarine pens, coastal fortifications, and command shelters throughout Europe. The key difference was not the technology itself, but the historical moment in which it was used. By 1945, Germany possessed some of the most advanced weapons of the war in specific categories, including advanced submarines, jet aircraft, and certain armored vehicles. However, individual technological achievements could not overcome broader industrial and strategic disadvantages. The Allies produced enormous quantities of equipment, allowing them to replace losses and maintain pressure across multiple fronts. This contrast can be seen clearly in armored warfare. Germany's late-war tanks, such as the Panther and Tiger, were heavily armed and often technically impressive. The Panther's long 75mm gun provided excellent anti-tank capability, and the Tiger's thick armor made it formidable in direct combat. However, they were expensive and complex to manufacture. Maintenance difficulties, fuel shortages, and limited production numbers reduced their overall impact. The Soviet T-34, by comparison, was designed around simplicity, reliability, and mass production. It was not always superior in every technical category, but its balance of firepower, mobility, protection, and ease of manufacture allowed Soviet forces to deploy it in enormous numbers. American Sherman tanks followed a similar philosophy, prioritizing reliability, logistical support, and quantity. These examples reflected a broader principle of industrial warfare. The best weapon was not always the most advanced one, but often the one that could be produced, maintained, and delivered in sufficient numbers. The same principle applied to command structures. A bunker could preserve leadership physically, but warfare in the 20th century depended upon much more than survival. Intelligence, transportation, communication, and industrial capacity determined success. The Führerbunker protected its occupants from immediate physical danger, yet it could not restore the collapsing system surrounding them. The historical significance of the bunker therefore extends beyond its concrete walls. It represents the limits of technology when separated from strategic reality. Engineering had created a remarkably durable structure, but no structure could compensate for exhausted armies, destroyed infrastructure, and the overwhelming power of opposing alliances. In the decades after the war, the remains of the Führerbunker became a subject of intense historical interest. The physical structure itself was largely demolished after the war as authorities attempted to prevent the location from becoming a symbolic site for extremist movements. Today, much of the original bunker complex lies beneath an ordinary residential area near the former Reich Chancellery site in Berlin. A small information board marks the location and explains its historical significance. Unlike famous battlefields where monuments preserve memories of sacrifice and victory, the Führerbunker has no grand memorial above ground. Its absence is itself meaningful. The site represents not military achievement, but the final consequences of dictatorship, war, and destruction. Researchers continue examining surviving documents, photographs, and eyewitness accounts to understand the final days inside the bunker. Archives preserve military reports, construction records, and personal testimonies from those who were present. These sources allow historians to separate documented events from rumors that emerged during the chaotic aftermath of Germany's defeat. Some details remain uncertain. The exact appearance of certain rooms has been reconstructed through conflicting accounts. Some personal experiences inside the bunker cannot be independently verified. Historians continue to analyze surviving evidence, acknowledging where records are incomplete, while maintaining the broader historical understanding of what occurred. The Führerbunker also influenced how later generations viewed leadership during wartime. The image of commanders directing battles from underground facilities became a recurring theme in military planning and popular culture. Modern nations continue to develop protected command systems, but these are generally integrated into larger networks designed to preserve communication and decision-making rather than isolate leaders from reality. The bunker survived because engineers understood one challenge: protecting people from explosions. It failed to solve another: protecting decisions from failure. Its greatest historical lesson lies not in the thickness of its walls, the strength of its doors, or the complexity of its systems. It lies in what happened when those walls became a barrier between leadership and reality. The Führerbunker was a triumph of engineering placed at the center of a strategic disaster, a structure built to endure destruction while witnessing the collapse of everything it was created to protect. The story of the Führerbunker does not end with the final commands issued beneath Berlin or the surrender of the German capital. Its deeper significance emerged in the years that followed, as historians, survivors, and future generations attempted to understand what this underground complex represented. It was not merely a location where one man died. It was the final physical expression of a political system that had transformed an entire continent through conquest, occupation, and destruction, before ultimately collapsing under the consequences of its own actions. When Soviet forces entered the Reich Chancellery area in early May 1945, they found a landscape of devastation. Berlin was no longer the capital of a powerful empire but a ruined city filled with destroyed buildings, abandoned equipment, and exhausted civilians. The streets surrounding the government district had become almost unrecognizable. Years of bombing and weeks of intense urban combat had reduced much of the area to rubble. The bunker itself remained hidden beneath this destruction. Its thick concrete structure had survived the battle, just as it had been designed to do. The irony was unavoidable. The same engineering that had successfully protected the command center from Allied bombs could not prevent the collapse of the regime operating inside it. After the war, the site became part of the divided landscape of Berlin. The ruins of the Reich Chancellery were eventually removed, and authorities in East Germany took measures to prevent the bunker from becoming a place of political pilgrimage for supporters of Nazism. Parts of the structure were destroyed or sealed, although the massive reinforced concrete sections proved extremely difficult to completely remove. For decades, the location remained surrounded by speculation. Myths developed about hidden rooms, secret escapes, and alternative endings for Nazi leaders. However, historians examining wartime documents, eyewitness testimony, and forensic evidence have largely rejected many of these claims. The surviving evidence indicates that the bunker served as the final headquarters of the Nazi leadership, and that Hitler died there on April 30, 1945. The study of the Führerbunker also reveals the human dimension of historical events. The people inside those underground rooms were not all powerful decision-makers. Many were secretaries, medical staff, communications workers, and soldiers carrying out assigned duties during a collapsing war. Their testimonies provide insight into the atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that existed during those final days. Among the most frequently studied accounts are those of Hitler's personal secretaries, military aides, and bunker personnel who survived the war. Their descriptions portray a confined environment where routine continued despite disaster. Documents were typed, messages were transmitted, meals were prepared, meetings were held. Yet outside the bunker, the world was changing by the hour. This contrast remains one of the most striking aspects of the Führerbunker. History often focuses on major battles, political decisions, and military campaigns. But the bunker reveals another side of war, the psychological environment of leaders facing defeat. It demonstrates how systems of power can continue functioning even when their foundations have already collapsed. The bunker also changed how historians examine the relationship between technology and warfare. The Second World War produced extraordinary engineering achievements. Radar, advanced aircraft, rockets, tanks, and communication systems transformed combat. The Führerbunker belonged to the same era of technological confidence, when nations believed that better machines could solve increasingly complex problems. But the bunker demonstrated the limitations of that belief. Concrete could resist bombs. Steel could strengthen doors. Communication equipment could transmit messages. None of these could create resources that no longer existed or restore armies that had already been destroyed. The final months of Nazi Germany showed that warfare was determined not only by individual weapons but by economic strength, industrial capacity, logistics, and strategic judgment. A nation could possess brilliant engineers and still lose a war because the larger system supporting those innovations had failed. Today, the memory of the Führerbunker remains closely connected to discussions about the dangers of authoritarian leadership and unchecked power. The bunker became the final destination of a regime that had promised national revival but brought catastrophic destruction to Germany and much of Europe. Its history is therefore studied not as a story of military achievement, but as a warning about the consequences of political extremism and aggressive expansion. The physical remains may be limited, but the historical evidence surrounding the bunker is extensive. Archives in Germany, Russia, Britain, and other countries preserve documents related to its construction, operation, and final days. Museums and research institutions continue examining photographs, military records, and personal testimonies to improve understanding of the events that occurred there. The absence of a dramatic monument at the site is deliberate. Unlike locations associated with liberation or victory, the Führerbunker represents a moment of collapse. Its importance comes not from celebrating what happened there, but from understanding why it happened. On April 30, 1945, when Hitler entered his private room beneath the Reich Chancellery, the bunker was still functioning exactly as engineers had intended. The lights remained on. The ventilation continued. Communications equipment still operated. The walls remained standing. Above ground, however, Nazi Germany was disappearing. The Soviet army was approaching the center of Berlin. The government buildings that symbolized Nazi power were burning. The military forces that had once conquered much of Europe were exhausted and defeated. The empire that had been promised to last for 1,000 years had collapsed in just over a decade. The bunker had begun as a symbol of preparation. It was designed during a period when German leaders believed they could protect themselves from the consequences of modern warfare. It ended as a symbol of isolation, showing how far leadership had separated itself from the reality experienced by ordinary people. The story of the Führerbunker is ultimately not about concrete, steel, or underground architecture. Those were only the physical elements. The true story lies in the choices made above and below ground, in the decisions that led millions into war, and in the final moments when those responsible faced the destruction they had helped create. The corridors where orders were once issued became silent. The rooms where military maps displayed imagined victories became evidence of defeat. The bunker that had been built to preserve power became the final witness to its disappearance. Decades later, beneath the modern streets of Berlin, there is little visible sign that this place once stood at the center of world history. Cars pass, buildings rise, everyday life continues. But beneath the surface remains the memory of a final underground command center where the last hours of Nazi Germany unfolded in darkness. A place built to withstand the bombs of war. A place designed to protect a leadership that believed it could control history. And a place that ultimately revealed one of history's most enduring lessons. No fortress, no army, and no leader can escape the consequences of reality.